City Club members, friends, guests, and community members, welcome to City Club of Central Oregon. Today's program is Nonprofits as an Economic Driver in Central Oregon. My name is Blair Garland, Senior Director of Community Relations and Marketing at OSU-Cascades, and I'm honored to serve as your City Club Board President. Today's forum sponsor is Sage. Sage writes specialty package and monoline insurance coverage for small to large nonprofit organizations. Nonprofits serve the needs of the community, which can leave them vulnerable to claims. While nonprofits serve our communities, Sage serves them. Our other forum sponsors for today are William and Ann Carwile and Eli and Dottie Ashley. Bill and Eli, thank you for the many hours you've devoted to volunteering at City Club. Today's live stream is also made possible by our partnership with Connect Central Oregon, a nonprofit launched with the assistance of the OSU-Cascades Innovation Co-Lab. I'd like to take a moment to thank our City Club annual sponsors. Even in this challenging year, our annual sponsors have continued to step up and support City Club because they care deeply about our community. Without their support, we would not be able to bring you today's program. You can find a list of all of our annual sponsors on our website, and I would encourage you to do so, but I would especially like to thank our platinum sponsors, Brooks Resources, St. Charles Health System, and the City of Bend, our community partner in education, OSU Cascades, and our gold sponsors, First Interstate Bank, ASI Wealth Management, and Pacific Source. Thank you for your support. We also depend on your membership support. Your investment in a City Club membership is an investment in civil, productive conversations about the topics that matter the most in our community. Your membership is also a personal statement that you believe civil discourse is so important, perhaps now more than ever. If you have been thinking about becoming a member, now would be a great time to do so. Now let me introduce today's moderator. Ann George is the Donor Relations Officer with Oregon Community Foundation. Ann works with individuals, families, and groups to achieve their philanthropic goals by connecting them to research, resources, and organizations to enhance the impact in their communities and beyond. Prior to coming to OCF, Ann was a professional mediator, facilitator, and public engagement specialist, focusing on community, family, public policy, and natural resource areas. In this work, she collaborated with individuals and groups across the region. She also served for many years in higher education in international programs and advising offices, as well as working in the international development field in both the United States and Central Europe. Ann holds a bachelor's degree in political science, a master's degree in international relations, and a certificate in advanced mediation. Thank you, and please enjoy today's program.
Hello, I'm Ann George, and we're here at our forum, and we're delighted to have you here. I want to kick us off to talk about nonprofits as an economic driver in Central Oregon. So Central Oregon, like most of the United States, has a vibrant nonprofit sector. Nationally, there are over 12.3 million people employed by nonprofits, and more than 64 million people serve as nonprofit volunteers. In the United States, 92% of nonprofits are small and community-based and exist to address community needs. Nationally, nonprofits employ more than 10% of the US private workforce, more jobs than manufacturing, construction, or finance. Our speakers today will share more about what a nonprofit is and is not, the types of nonprofits we have here in Central Oregon, and their role in our economic structure here in Central Oregon. In addition, they'll share why they feel they are important to a vibrant community and its members. These organizations, nonprofits, serve critical needs in community, promote and support democracy, spur innovation, and what is often overlooked, they contribute substantially to the economic health and stability of our communities. We are at a time of substantial need here as we continue to face a pandemic and its serious economic fallout, and the ongoing critical call for social justice. Couple these realities with the threat of wildfire in our own community, as demonstrated in Oregon this fall, there's a lot to do to help people and communities thrive and keep our cities and towns safe. The organization I work for, Oregon Community Foundation, in partnership with our incredible donors, and like many other foundations, increased our grant making in 2020 in response to the realities of our time. From 2020 to 2019, there was an increase of over 44% at OCF alone in our grant making. And as I mentioned, other foundations did similar, and many of us individually provided more. And as we know, 2021 will continue to be another critical year. But these organizations we support, these nonprofits, are not organizations that simply seek funds and provide critical social services. They play a number of important roles in our local, regional, state, and international economic systems. Our speakers will share more about our nonprofit sector here in Central Oregon across our 3 counties. And I thought I would share an interesting tidbit to start us off. When we talk about economic growth in community and nonprofits, did you know that a nonprofit here that many of us know, J, employs roughly as many people here in Central Oregon as our oldest, most prominent brewery, and many more than their production site alone? When we're talking about the nonprofit sector as an economic driver, we're talking about a sector that both provides a substantial number of jobs here, and in turn, it provides an incredible number of critical services that benefit our economic and social sector in a myriad of ways. So we'll now hear more from our incredible speakers today. I'll introduce for both of them. Jim White serves as the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. Jim is deeply committed to social change and has worked in the nonprofit sector, both domestically and internationally, for more than 25 years. He has a passion for affecting systemic change in the way that the public, private, and nonprofit sectors work together to support and strengthen an equitable, just, and robust civil society. Before joining NAO, Jim worked for Mercy Corps, both overseas and in Oregon. He has also worked for the International Organization for Migration Relief International and the American Red Cross. Jim earned a Bachelor in Science and Engineering Technology from Temple University and an MA in Central Eurasian Area Studies from Indiana University. Damon Runberg is a familiar face to those of us here at City Club. He is a state economist with the Oregon Employment Department covering Central Oregon, the Klamath Basin, and the Columbia River Gorge. He calculates the monthly employment and unemployment estimates for the area's counties. Additionally, Damon tracks various economic indicators critical to the region's economy. He writes prolifically and regularly gives presentations on the state of the local economy. Damon received his Master of Public Policy from Oregon State University, Corvallis, where he specialized in econometric analysis and natural resource economics. Before that, he received his undergraduate from Gonzaga University. So Jim and Damon, thank you so much for joining us today. I thought we'd start off, Jim, maybe with you, and we'd love for you to give us an idea. When we use the term nonprofit, what does that mean? And what are the different types of nonprofits in the United States?
Thanks so much, Ann, and thanks everybody for joining us. I'm really excited to be here today, and I hope if there's anything you leave with here today is a deeper sense of devotion and loyalty to your Central Oregon nonprofits. I think Damon and I can give you a lot of reasons why. Nonprofit is probably the term that I would most like to change about our sector. Why would you tell people that you're something you're not, right? So I would love if we could all just rebrand ourselves as the independent sector or the public goods sector or something else other than to say that we're nonprofit. The issue is that nonprofits nationally were classified based on our tax status. And that's been the label that has stuck all these years. There's many, many different kinds of nonprofits, as I call them. They're kind of like the flavors at Baskin Robbins, where there's actually 29 different types of nonprofit in federal IRS statute. That is what determines our status as a corporate structure in America, and that it follows through into Oregon statute. It's relayed and copied through Oregon Revised Statute, Chapter 65. The different types of nonprofits, I could say, generally break into 2 main categories. There are those that are public or charitable benefit, and I think that's most of the types of nonprofits that we're going to be talking about today. And then there's a whole group of nonprofits that are called mutual benefit, and those are nonprofits who only support their members. So examples of those would be veterans associations, a credit union, the Eagles or Lions clubs, or groups like that, where it's some type of a order who comes together for some type of, personship together, fellowship together, whatever you want to call it, and they're serving only their members. They may have some level of a nonprofit. They are described as a nonprofit in the law, and they may have some level of ability not to pay certain kinds of taxes. But what they cannot do that a charitable nonprofit can do is that they cannot give a receipt to their donors that says that this can be something that they can recognize on their taxes and get some kind of benefit for it. And so the charitable benefit nonprofits, that's the group I think we're going to be concentrating on most today, are those kinds of organizations that I think many of you know and love in Central Oregon. It's, as Ann mentioned, J-Bar J, it's the Relief Nursery, it's the High Desert Museum, it's groups like that that are serving some type of a charitable purpose. They are private corporations doing public good. Doing some type of public benefit is probably the easiest way to think of them. So that's sort of a round out of what they are. We're lucky in that in the statistics that I think Damon and Anna and I are going to share here shortly, that there is a relatively large concentration of nonprofits registered in Central Oregon, particularly in Deschutes County, but broadly across the Tri-County area. In fact, that area is ranked third in the number of total nonprofits that are charitable nonprofits that we certainly track in size. So you have about the third largest conglomeration of nonprofits in Central Oregon, after, of course, the Portland metro area, and then second is in and around Eugene, Springfield, Lane County area. So I'll stop there, so Ann, you can get on to the next.
Great, thanks so much, Jim. Damon, I wonder if you can help ground us on some of more what we're talking about, but what does the nonprofit sector look like as we look at economic indicators in Central Oregon? So how many organizations are there and how many folks are employed by nonprofits in Central Oregon?
Yeah, great question. And once again, just thank you for having me here. It's my pleasure. And I'm excited to hear and learn more from Jim and you, Ann, as well, as you guys are the experts on nonprofits. I'm just a numbers guy, right? So I have lots of numbers. I don't want to get too crazy with sharing stats, but I think it's important to quantify or what the magnitude of this sort of sector is. And as Jim pointed out, nonprofits, it's sort of a catch-all, and there are a variety of different types of nonprofits that are out there. And as Jim mentioned as well, that it's sort of based on tax status. And from our perspective at the employment department, all nonprofits are lumped underneath the same payroll taxes label of just nonprofits. So our charitables, the mutual, like whatever the categories that exist out there are all lumped together when I'm going to share anything employment related. So just sort of know that in the back of your mind. But roughly speaking, here in Central Oregon, we have, well over 1,000 nonprofit organizations, 1,111, lots of ones in there across the Tri-County area. But when we're looking at those nonprofits that we would consider payroll establishments, organizations or businesses that actually have employees with covered under unemployment insurance, think your sort of W-2 employee type folks, roughly half of those are what we'd consider payroll establishments. So around 540 or so across the Tri-County area. And before I get too much into Central Oregon, I think it's important to sort of look higher level, sort of what does the landscape look like in Oregon? And statewide, we have just under 10,000 nonprofit payroll establishments. Once again, these are those that have employees, not just any organization. There's many, for instance, of these organizations aren't payroll establishments because they might be very small, maybe volunteer-based, et cetera. So that's why you have nearly double the number of nonprofits than there are payroll establishments. But nearly 10,000 across the state of Oregon. And as of 2019, there was 198,000 jobs across the state of Oregon that were in these nonprofits. So a ton of jobs out there. And, there's we'll get into pay, I think, in a little bit, but just know in the back of your mind that there's a considerable spread that exists within the pay spectrum of the workers within the nonprofit sector. where we have around 62% of all the jobs in the nonprofit sector making more than $20 an hour, and about 20% making less than $15 an hour. So you have a big chunk, 1 in 5 jobs are sort of in that sort of low, really low wage side of the spectrum. And then, but you do have a majority who we consider sort of like a living wage job off of these within the nonprofit sector. And man, it's funny because we tend to be industry driven when we talk about employment numbers, and it's interesting to talk from a tax filing perspective because there are lots of industries represented within the nonprofit sector, which you know, when you think about the nonprofits you interact with, there's no surprise there, I suppose. But really, what we see is there's 3 industries that dominate the nonprofit sector employment. That would be healthcare and social assistance, which represents roughly 60% of all of the jobs we see across the state are in healthcare and social assistance, the nonprofit side. Other services is another big one, and we'll get into some of the details of what other services, what types of organizations are underneath that catch-all, and then educational services as well. So those are sort of the 3 big ones. Those together account for 85% of all nonprofit employment across the state. And ultimately, hospitals are a bit of the elephant in the room in here. You know, not only is healthcare amongst the largest amount of jobs within the nonprofit healthcare side, but really they account for a huge share of just the nonprofit as a whole, or just hospitals. And so I'm actually going to sort of later on here break apart hospitals from the nonprofits so that we can get a better idea of what we're seeing within the nonprofit sector. But generally across the state, what we see is that in metropolitan areas, about 10% of all non-farm jobs are in nonprofits. So 1 in 10 in your metropolitan areas. That share is a little bit lower in rural counties, about 7%. The difference or the discrepancy we see there is really hospitals and to a lesser degree, higher education. So our big hospitals across the state tend to be concentrated in our metropolitan areas. They're healthcare hubs. So you have a higher concentration of nonprofit jobs there. And then, like I said, higher education are sort of private 4-year institutions, our private colleges. Those tend to mostly be all nonprofits as well. And those are concentrated in metropolitan areas for the most part as well. So you sort of see this discrepancy there between metro and rural. And here in Central Oregon, we're sort of right in the middle of that, where roughly 9% of all of our jobs are represented in nonprofit establishments. So just a marginally higher share there. And I apologize, I've been narrating for a while here, but there's a lot of numbers to share. So if you want to interrupt me, and you can, but I could just keep ripping away here. So so if we look at Central Oregon now, so that's sort of just a statewide snapshot we'll see with the numbers there. If we look at Central Oregon, the Tri-County area, like I said, around 540 non-profit payroll establishments, and we're going to exclude the hospital when we talk about Central Oregon. So St. Charles is not included here. And once again, we're excluding St. Charles for a variety of reasons. It's the elephant in the room. It sort of limits me from talking about the details within the nonprofit sector if I include them for some confidentiality reasons. But also, they're such a meaningful, high-paying, large employer that we don't really get to see or understand the trends that are happening within the nonprofit sector here in Central Oregon when they're included in there. So just know St. Charles is really important. They're critical to our economy here in Central Oregon, but we're not talking about them when we zoom in here on the Central Oregon jobs. So the non-St. Charles nonprofit sector, around 4,500 jobs here in Central Oregon. And when we cut out St. Charles, we go from having roughly 9% of all of our jobs being in the nonprofit sector to about 4.5% of all of our jobs being in the nonprofit sector. Giving you an idea of the magnitude of their sort of elephant in the roomness, if you will, for St. Charles. This is where Central Oregon really stands out as far as our share of nonprofits. When you exclude hospitals, once again, Central Oregon's employment in nonprofits represents 4.5% of total non-farm employment. Statewide, it's only 1.6%. So we have a really sizable sort of market share in nonprofits when you cut hospitals out here in Central Oregon, which is a good thing. And we'll get into some of the good reasons, what are the benefits that we get from these nonprofits specifically, but having a high share is definitely not a bad thing. And you could share my first slide if you can, Scott, which sort of just breaks down where we see the establishments and the employment within Central Oregon by the different sectors. And you can see, for the most part, there's a really, really high concentration of these jobs are concentrated in this sort of grant-making, civic, professional, and similar organizations. For the most part, think labor unions, economic development, churches, the Humane Society, conservation organizations. These are all sort of lumped in that top category right there. So a lot of the nonprofits that we interact with on a daily basis are, for the most part, fall in that top sector there. We're over 250 payroll establishments here in Central Oregon and well over 1,000 jobs. Maybe the last, should I talk about COVID? COVID is, one of these things where it's like always in the back of everyone's mind. Do you want to hear an update, Ann? We'll get a little nod there. Okay. So COVID has been pretty devastating to the nonprofit sector from an employment perspective. For some perspectives, over the last 10 years, the nonprofit sector has far outpaced employment growth than the total non-farm sector as a whole. 44% growth in employment over the last 10 years before COVID started. So this has been a sector of our economy that has continued to add jobs really uninterrupted since our last recession. But second quarter 2020, so sort of right after the COVID shock occurred, employment levels had dropped roughly 15.5% in Central Oregon and nonprofits compared to what they were in the second quarter of 2019. So a year-over-year drop of over 15.5%. That represents 700 jobs here in Central Oregon. 700 jobs. I mean, that's a lot of people who lost their jobs in the nonprofit sector. And as Scott, my second slide is showing some of these stats here, if you want to put that one up. What's devastating is that those losses are more severe than we see in sort of the total non-farm side. Not nearly as severe as we see in sort of leisure and hospitality, I suppose, but not far behind that sort of magnitude of losses we saw there. One interesting thing you'll see, though, is that the drop in payroll, so the actual money being paid in wages to workers, only dropped by 1.1% through the second quarter. This is a pattern that we've seen not exclusive to nonprofits. This is a pattern through the COVID shock that we've seen across the entire economy, where jobs are hit much worse than payrolls. And what's happening here is that we're seeing that low-wage workers are taking the brunt of the layoffs. And so we don't see actual payroll dropping nearly as much as the employment numbers. And it's the same story we're seeing here in nonprofits, where our low-wage nonprofit workers have been hit much, much harder with these layoffs than some of the higher wage workers within the industry, or I shouldn't say industry, within the sector. So the good news is this is numbers through the second quarter, so it looks really devastating. We do know that there's been considerable rebounding through third and parts of the fourth quarter of 2020. That data is just not publicly available yet, so we can't share that. But we do know that we've been moving in the right direction. But know in the back of your mind, it has been one of the sectors really hardest hit through COVID.
Thanks, Damon. Really interesting statistics there and really helpful for our discussion. So it's interesting, and Jim, maybe we could talk about you. There's so many things that nonprofits do in community, and certainly hearing those number of 700 essentially people who aren't providing service in our community at a time of incredible need is something to really think about. I'm just wondering, Jim, if you could talk about, in addition to jobs, what are some of the other economic impacts in our community or region from the nonprofit sector here? And Damon, I know you probably have something to add here too. But Jim, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Ann. There are a lot of impacts that nonprofits have, both economically from a actual employees paying for goods and services, maybe keeping those oldest breweries open. I think they do a lot of that. There's also these, sort of ancillary as the ripples go away, the drops that are out there of how money gets spent when you have a sector that is spending money. So they obviously these are private corporations, again, doing public good, these nonprofits. They have their own need for rental of buildings, of cleaning services, of hiring outside professionals who do their legal and CPA work, and they do banking, and they do all these other parts of the the work of any kind of a corporation. In this case, they just happen to be charitable and nonprofit, or the group that I'm talking about is charitable. So they have all those ancillary benefits that come off of having a group of corporations in your community who are spending money, right? There's a lot of talk I've heard, gotten challenges a lot of like, well, the nonprofit sector is not a traded sector. Obviously, that's true. We're not a traded sector, but at the same time, we are also a sector that brings in money from outside of the state into the state that would not have otherwise been invested in Oregon. And, a good example is you yourselves at Oregon Community Foundation. There are people who may have left universities, or they may have left a particular area, but they still care about Oregon. They still care about the environment. They want there to be organizations out there who are doing protections for the greater good for public lands, or doing work for domestic violence. And so they are moved to give to these organizations regardless of whether they happen to live in Oregon. And we see again and again where there are huge gifts and amounts of money that come into communities that would not have been brought into the community except but for the fact that nonprofits are there. The final thing I would add here is the value, the economic value of the services themselves. This is very difficult to quantify. There have been debates, and Damon and I had great conversations offline about this before, around there's debates about, are we even really using the right measures when it comes to measuring gross domestic product or gross state product, in how the value of the thing that a corporation, a company does has economic impacts on the community far beyond the sale value or the employment value. And there has been a movement in the last, let's say, 15 years to modify or think about moving from gross domestic product measures to what are called genuine process indicators, or genuine product indicators. And these measures are mostly centered around the value of the good or service, in addition to the value of the actual money spent by the corporation in the community. So a quick way to kind of understand this is, if you have a private corporation that does things that maybe some would quantify as those are actually negative for the community because they create problems in health, they create problems in other ways, they're big polluters or something. What are the economic impacts that later the society has to deal with through taxes, through the government intervention, through some other means, that product has on society, as compared to, by being charitable organizations, the economy of the good that we do, the things that we do, are required by both federal and state law to meet this public benefit threshold. So they have to be things that are sort of above the line in terms of the value for community. And I say that value both as sort of societally and also economically. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think, Jim, you do a great job sort of illustrating this point that there's sort of two ways we can measure value. And one of them is that sort of traditional sense, this sort of how many dollars are circulated because of the activity within a particular business or organization, sort of our traditional way of thinking about economic impact, is this churning of dollars. And then there's another side, which is sort of the value that the service or the product that you produce has to a community. And typically, like if you produce some sort of widget, like a window or something like that, there's a tangible value to the window that you manufacture. And in many cases, and we'll get into this a little bit, but in many cases, some of the services provided by some of these nonprofits don't necessarily have an easy dollar value assigned to them, that the benefit that they produce. So I'll start with the easier part, those organizations that churn dollars and what the impact looks like first. And Scott, if you could throw up my employment multiplier slide. We have a way of sort of quantifying the impact that, what is one direct job in a particular type of business or organization what sort of ripple effect through the economy do we see with one job? Or in this case, we're talking for every 100 jobs, 100 direct jobs that an organization might have. And there's sort of two multipliers that we look at. The first is what we call indirect spending. This is sort of supply chain spending within the organization or the business. This is the money that the organization spends in turn or to produce the goods or service that they render. So a classic example would be, some sort of manufacturing company that builds, say, steel cabinetry. The money that they spend procuring the actual raw steel that they use to make their cabinets out of would be an indirect expense. And that has, there are jobs that are supported by that indirect expense through the supply chain. The second type of multiplier that we see are called induced jobs, or the induced impact. And these are jobs that are supported by the spending of the direct jobs themselves. So I work for the Oregon Employment Department. They pay me a salary, and then I choose to go to the grocery store and spend money. And so I'm sort of indirectly, my spending is inducing employment in grocery stores to a small extent, because of my spending at the grocery store or a Lyft operator at Mount Bachelor if I buy a Lyft ticket, et cetera. So there's this induced effect that happens from the direct spending. So the numbers that we see here on this graphic are sort of what is the combination, that sort of multiplier we see, how many jobs are supported for every 100 direct jobs that are there. And you can see I highlighted in blue some of the sectors that have really high concentrations of nonprofit organizations within them. And so, for instance, that grant making, giving, and social advocacy group there, it has more than a 1-to-1 ratio there. So there is more than one job supported for every one job that is directly created by an organization there. That's a really high multiplier. And you can see it's really competitive too when you compare it against some of these other sectors that are known to have high multipliers, such as advertising and marketing, or even much higher than some of our local manufacturing businesses, such as wood, windows, and door manufacturing there, which has less than a 1-to-1 ratio. Still really solid though. For every 100, you get 80 jobs that are supported outside of that. And so you can see that there's this really high concentration of these high multipliers here. That's that direct impact that we're able to measure, not just the jobs, but that they're also supporting other components of the economy through the work that they're doing at these nonprofits. But you could see that there's quite a few of these blue lines towards the bottom there, something like the community food, housing, and other relief services, the educational service, et cetera. They're relatively low on the multiplier range there. So you would look at this and say, well, these aren't particularly important or impactful for our local economy. To the contrary, I would actually argue that some of these sort of low multiplier type organizations serve a purpose that might have a larger impact than even some of the high multiplier organizations might have. So what we see, for instance, is that these low multiplier organizations or businesses provide really critical community services, such as food, housing support, homeless services, the education, et cetera. And the low economic impact doesn't mean low importance. What it means is that they have lower wages generally. And it also means that they're not really buying a lot of goods or services from other parts of the economy, the indirect spending piece. So that doesn't mean, once again, that they're not important. It also means that they tend to be types of services that are less profitably rendered from the private sector, which is why you tend to see these concentrated either in the public sector or the nonprofit sectors, because it's really hard to make money doing this work. It's really hard to provide homeless services and be profitable providing services to homeless folks, right? It just doesn't add up. But it is a critical service that we need for sustaining our communities. And so there is still a lot of importance there, a lot that we should focus on, even though we can't sort of measure the dollars that are changing hands amongst the folks within those organizations. So it's unfortunate that, like Jim said, we don't have indicators that can really capture the benefit of some of these low multiplier, but high for value of community services. But there is a distinct important value there.
Thanks, Damon. Thanks, Jim. And just a follow up to that, I'm just curious for the two of you, just a quick response. One of the things that we've talked about a little bit in other discussions, that the arts center, that's part of the nonprofit sector that probably doesn't have a high multiplier, effect? What is that impact for bringing industry or jobs, or even retaining high-paying jobs here? I'm wondering if you could speak to that at all, or if that's a reality or something. Yeah, Jim?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, I mean, if they're but for these kinds of services, whether it's arts and culture, whether it's people protecting the environment, these things that are not what you would normally sort of classify as in sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, let's say, these things that tend to be more at the top of the triangle than the bottom. And what I mean there is that the things that aren't necessarily helping people who are experiencing homelessness or working with kids who have experienced domestic violence or things like that. This is more these things that bring joy and happiness to a community. Well, a lot of the reason that people move to Central Oregon and live and raise families there and enjoy all the wonderful things that are available is because there are mountains and there are trails that are available for people to hike. There are arts and cultural events. There are walks along the Deschutes River that people can get involved with. And a lot of that is organized by nonprofits. So there is a huge amount of value in the types of things that they do that can't be quantified in that way, but bring a very real value to people's lives. And you know, Anne, you mentioned at the beginning, I mean, I worked internationally for many years. I've worked in a lot of places around the world where there is not that capacity to have that joy and care of the environment and protection of, you know, endangered species and those types of things. And so when you have that, you have a less thriving civil society. You don't have those same protections. So having what I call all three legs of the stool of a civil society, having the public sector do its proper work and you know, protecting the types of responsibilities that they must do, having a private sector driving employment and innovation and, you know, for a large part the economy, but having a third independent sector that can keep both to some degree accountable and serves this very special role of private people not having to go through the government and for non-profit making means doing good for their community. It's when people ask me the question about, well, are there too many nonprofits? I think it's the wrong question to ask. Why would you limit the way that people care about and love their community? And Scott mentioned earlier, Damon mentioned earlier, Scott, I'm looking at your name on the board here. Damon mentioned earlier that there are a whole bunch of nonprofits who don't employ anybody. These are volunteers. Oregon ranks third in the country in volunteerism. 43% of Oregonians volunteer. That's huge. That's an Oregonian value, let's say, right? There is huge value in that amount of person hours per year that doesn't then get fitted into what Scott can provide in these particular, you know, charts. So having that care and love of community is hugely important, and there's huge value to that. And I think this is exactly one of the reasons that Oregon and Central Oregon in particular are places to live.
Yeah, and there's a term for this that we call, you know, so for quality of life is a huge passion of mine for talking about the economic value there. One of my mentors when I was early in my career as an economist was Professor Ed Whitelaw from the University of Oregon. He was one of our more prominent economists that we've had across the state. And he came up with this term back in the 1980s. It's called the second paycheck. And the way he described it was, and I'll quote him here because I think it's beautiful the way he said it himself from his words, was that every worker in Oregon receives in effect two paychecks, one denominated in dollars, the dollars that you get from your employer itself, right, your paycheck, and the other in the state's clean air, clean streams, scenic vistas, publicly owned beaches, and forested mountains. What he was getting to with this idea of the second paycheck is this notion that we all get something else, some sort of, we can't really necessarily quantify it in a dollar value, but we all get something from the place we live. If I value theater, then there is a really high second paycheck in some place like New York City. If I value mountain biking, then Bend, Oregon sounds really attractive to me, right? And there is a value there. I'm willing to actually forego a smaller first paycheck in order to get a bigger second paycheck. That's why we see people move to high quality of life communities, giving up maybe a career opportunity for advancement or whatever it might be. Well, here in Central Oregon, really all over the globe, but nonprofit organizations here are doing a lot of work to help build that second paycheck for us in Central Oregon, whether that's protecting natural resources, encouraging or funding arts and culture, providing educational or learning opportunities, things like the High Desert Museum, facilitating recreation, especially for recreation for people with disabilities, even attracting new businesses to the region. These second paycheck elements that are supported by a lot of our nonprofits in and of themselves are economic drivers for attracting people to Central Oregon, bringing good quality workers to our communities, and making us to continue to be sort of a livable, exciting, thriving community to be in. So it's hard. I could not understate the fact that the second paycheck element is so critical for us here in Central Oregon, and our nonprofit sector is really critical in maintaining that to the degree that it has been.
Great, thank you both. I wonder, Jim, you mentioned the idea of both of you in terms of what the nonprofit sector, where it's hard to quantify some of what they bring to community, especially in the economic realities of communities and regions. But I'm wondering, in parts of Oregon, there are areas that probably have a weaker nonprofit sector or less, or they have trouble fundraising because of the socioeconomics of the community. Do you have any thoughts or experiences on what is that community compared to here in our Tri-County area where we seem to have a robust nonprofit sector?
Yeah, I can jump in there. So obviously there are places in Oregon that have a smaller population, and so there is less opportunity for those organizations to be created. In many cases, the organizations that do exist, the nonprofit organizations that do exist, that try to do those key services that other nonprofits do in Central Oregon, are all volunteer again. So they're not showing up the same way in like some of Damon's statistics, but they are still there. They are still doing work. They are still holding cultural events. They may be relying or connecting in with statewide nonprofits. We do have a lot of statewide or even region-wide nonprofits who do work out of urban cores, but they're doing work far beyond their own particular area. And so there's definitely a loss of the quality of life by a inversely proportionate ratio of how many nonprofits you may have in a particular community. And those nonprofits may be concentrating more on the lower ends of that Maslow's hierarchy of needs scale than they are able to on the upper end. So they're really worried about job creation. They're really worried about human service related issues, and the issues that might bring greater cultural joy or environmental support or things like that might be left to more regional or even statewide nonprofits who they hopefully engage with.
Great, thanks. I'm going to keep us moving because I know we want to get to some of the questions that are coming in. But one other question before we get to some other what we're seeing from other folks on the participating today. One of the questions that sometimes will come up is the notion of wages in the nonprofit sector. And Damon, you mentioned even just the variety amongst not only organizations, but even the real hit that some of these organizations have taken in the COVID times with those 700 jobs lost in the second quarter of 2020. So as folks consider supporting a nonprofit, sometimes a question that comes up is about those wages. There can be some resistance from donors to have their donations go to pay for salaries. We know that there's only a certain number of dollars that are circulating to nonprofits. What should we think about those as we think about nonprofits as economic engines and providing jobs. What do we think about those wages, or what is there another question or another way for us to think about that, or what do you think?
Well, I'll let Jim cover in a second here the bigger question about sort of fundamentally thinking about how much someone should make in a nonprofit business or organization. But I'll sort of cover what they actually make. So what do the payroll records tell us? So the average annual wage, I don't know if I remember if I said that or not, but for nonprofits statewide, including hospitals, is around $54,500 a year. $54,500, and that is almost identical to the statewide annual average wage of $55,000 a year. So just marginally lower than what we see. So it's not an excess or anything like that, a particularly high-paying sector. If we focus on Central Oregon, when we're cutting out St. Charles, once again, St. Charles being an organization that has a lot of high-wage workers or middle-wage workers as well, we see that the annual average wage here in Central Oregon without the hospital in nonprofits is around $36,000 a year, which is over $10,000 less a year than our total non-farm average. So it's on the low end of the pay. So when you hear criticisms, perhaps, of nonprofits, all these high-paying nonprofit workers, on average, it doesn't show that. It's not an industry where people are going to, or a sector people are going to make the big bucks. They're likely working in these sectors because they're passionate about the work that's being done there. But that being said, as an economist, I always have to illustrate or emphasize this point. Just because someone's passionate about a particular mission of an organization doesn't mean that you should pay them less because of their passion. In order to continue to have good workers doing these important roles, you need to pay a competitive wage. And so oftentimes, maybe that's where the criticism comes from of some of these higher wage jobs within nonprofits is, oh, how do you justify paying X number of dollars for your executive at this nonprofit? Well, the answer is if you don't pay them that, then they're not going to work in your nonprofit, and they're probably going to move to the private sector anyway. So you have to be at least competitive in the market to some extent on the wage side to do this work or do these services.
Damon, just a quick clarification. I had a question come in. When you're talking about the salaries, are you talking full-time, part-time, and same with the number of jobs? Is there can you pull those numbers out, or is it one figure?
We can't with the nonprofits pull it out based on for-profit or for the nonprofit sector to look at it by an hourly rate in the same way that we can sort of for the economy as a whole. Generally, we do know hours to some extent, and the hours tend to be lower on average in nonprofit businesses. That totally makes sense, though, where you have a lot of workers who might do it as sort of a side job. They might do a couple hours a week helping assist in some educational program or whatever it might be. So you do see a lot more part-time work here, and that wouldn't necessarily affect the average annual wage because it's all relative to the number of hours worked is what your pay is. So anyways, it is a contributing factor maybe in some of the lower wages, and also you tend to pay part-time workers less than your full-time workers anyways. So it could be a contributing factor there, but it's hard for us to break down explicitly sort of what the part-time versus full-time workers are making.
Thanks, Jim. When your work, which is nonprofits all the time, what do you think about this question around wages? What should we be thinking here?
Well, we are huge advocates for paying people a living wage, and absolutely, our philosophical approach to this is, these nonprofits are providing such a valuable resource to the communities that they're serving. They should not be expected to do that service on the blood and backs of their own employees. That service has such enormous value. There are absolutely great community members who are volunteering their time. They're deciding that they are in a position where they don't need to take a wage, and that is wonderful. I think that in some ways has almost, though, confused the issue for nonprofits for years in the intermingling of those people who are passionately connected to the mission of the organization and they want to volunteer their time, and those people who are passionately connected to the mission of the organization, but they're doing this as a profession. They actually have some specialization. And to Damon's point is that we would not want to see a situation where the types of people that you want doing the kinds of services that nonprofits are known to do are not competitive with their private sector or public sector equivalents, right? So that is a real problem if you don't have people who are, and I know that we've put St. Charles to the side, but you don't want your ophthalmologist or your brain surgeon or your heart, your cardiologist paid less than they would have been able to make if they'd gone to a different kind of hospital because it has a different profit scheme, a business model. The same is true, I think, for every other type of nonprofit. You want those domestic violence services, you want those addiction services, you want those protections of the environment done by people who have a professional background and they've dedicated their lives to this work.
And you're muted.
You're muted. Yep.
Thank you. Great response. Thank you. Well, some of the questions coming in are around sort of this, we're talking about how these, the economic impacts of nonprofits, and some of the questions coming in are around, and Jim, you talked a bit about this, and you too, Damon, but the idea of why does this nonprofit sector need to exist? Why does it not get taken care of elsewhere, either in the private or government sectors? And sort of the question around capitalism with all of this. I wonder if that's probably formal on its own, but if you could talk for a minute or two about that, that'd be terrific.
I will, and I was saving these because I thought this might come up. Scott, if you could show my slide 1, I did reserve in case there was this possibility. So this is a slide showing you a study that was done by the group called Independent Sector. They're sort of what NAO does, but they do it nationally. And this was a study, a poll that they did back in May and June of last year. They did it with national pollsters. So this was all done with, right looking, left looking, telephone poll, survey, focus groups, the whole bit. And what this found was that there is a deep sense of institutions failing the general public. Again, this was done last May and June. People saying, half of the people saying the system is failing them. The percent of Americans who agreed, you can see here, I'm not going to read all this out to you, but this sense of injustice, this desire for change, this lack of confidence, lack of hope. Specifically, 47% of people saying that capitalism as it exists today does more harm than good in the world. Those are pretty compelling numbers. Scott, if you could show the next slide. Slide 2 shows who is trusted to lead change in society. And again, here we see that at the low end of the spectrum, so the bars that are the lowest down there, CEOs, captains of industry, government leaders, and the very wealthy are least trusted to make change for societal good. The people who are most trusted, and again, this was done last May and June, so as you can imagine, scientists suddenly took a huge shot up when you have people like Dr. Fauci on the news all the time, right? We're in the middle of the COVID crisis. But I would draw attention to the second bar from the left there. 71% of Americans are saying people in my local community. Well, that's who makes up the nonprofit sector. It's people in your local community leading change. Then you can see as this goes down, the trust that people have in various levels of different institutions. The final point I wanted to make here is the next slide, number 3, Scott, if you could. Specifically, they asked the question related to confidence in nonprofits to help strengthen society. The polling numbers are off the charts. 81% have confidence that nonprofits are the people who are leading that kind of change. So that's, I think, my answer to your question, Anne, is there is huge benefit for these organizations because there is a perception of what they do that goes way beyond the economic impacts of what they do, and especially at a time in America and in Oregon when we have such divisions and such a different way of our people who live in communities looking at the world and looking at how their community should be organized. So you can stop showing my slides now, Scott. Thanks.
So I'll be quick on this one, but I think an important concept is, maybe many of you have probably heard of it before. It's called the tragedy of the commons. And it's this this economic conversation, theoretical conversation about if there is a shared common pool resource, and we all collectively have access to it, are we going to manage that resource in the long run sustainably and such that we don't deplete it immediately? And Eleanor Oakstrom, who is a prominent economist who actually won the Nobel Prize in economics for her work on the tragedy of the commons and common pool resources, helps illustrate the point that, ultimately we think we live in this capitalist, completely free market world, and we don't, and thank God we don't, because the market should be very free or mostly free, but not completely free. Because in a free market setup, what we see is that the incentive there is for these common pool resources to be completely depleted. So the common examples that we hear are clean air, clean water, oceans, forests, public lands, et cetera. These sorts of resources like this, if they are not administered or managed separate from the market, then we collectively as human beings are going to we're going to bite the hand that feeds us. We're going to get what's ours. And so the role of government is important in protecting these things like common pool resources. And nonprofits also fall into this category as well. So ultimately the nonprofits help avoid the tragedy of the commons, if you will.
That's great. I'm watching the clock here. It looks like we're almost out of time. Perhaps another forum on this. Certainly folks are talking about the idea of different systems of government and social services and how those are provided. And certainly, Jim, to your point, maybe some different levels of perception of trust across different sectors in different places in the world. Well, I want to thank both of you. There are lots of questions we didn't get to today. Lots of good comments on Facebook and YouTube for those watching this. Scroll down and see those comments. Great input from a lot of our nonprofit community who are doing such work. They always have, and in particular during these times, your work is so appreciated, and we thank you all. I also want to thank our two speakers, Damon and Jim. Thank you so much for sharing today. And I'll just share a little bit to wrap us up. Again, I want to thank our speakers for taking time out of their busy schedules. You're seeing the Central Oregon sun. If anyone's seeing this from the Valley, that's what's on. I can't get away from it today. It's coming in my window. I love it. And we want to thank today's forum sponsors, Sage Insurance Solutions, Bill and Ann Carwile, and Eli and Dottie Ashley. Thank you for your support of City Club. Remember, if you enjoyed today's forum and would like to help support City Club, please consider becoming a member or live stream sponsor at cityclubco.org. Coming up in our next forum, our region is often called Oregon Nice or Pacific Northwest Nice by other areas of the country. But is Central Oregon as welcoming as we think? Systemic racism and social injustice still exist, even 155 years after the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. It can be hard to acknowledge that these issues may be closer to home than we think. We'll take a look at Central Oregon's history of racial exclusion that invites a discussion of our community's diversity and acceptance. Join Marcus LeGrand, project consultant, Allyship in Action, Kip Jones, executive pastor at Antioch Church, Jenna Goodman-Campbell, Bend City Councilor, and a speaker from Bend Lapine Schools to learn what initiatives they're taking and how you can ensure that Central Oregon grows to be more diverse, safe, and accessible to everyone. Learn about the past, present, and future of acceptance at our February 18th live stream. Please be sure you're on our email list by signing up at cityclubco.org. Thank you all so much for watching today. Please continue to cultivate conversation about issues that connect us all to build a strong community. Thank you again.